Well, good evening, everybody. I'm going to give a brief introduction because the topic is, of course, a bit hot and controversial. And I want to set the stage so that we go in the right direction with this. I'm, of course, a primatologist. And so my focus is on the primates. But since humans are also primates, it extends also to our own species. And I want to start with saying a few things about sex and gender. Sex is usually a term that we use for the biological side, the chromosomes, the hormones, the genitals. Sex is mostly binary, not 100%, it's maybe 99 or 98% binary. And even the binary, you should not take black and white, because within the categories male and female, there's a lot of variability too. But that's the sex side, and it has a sexual dimorphism, which in our species, you know, the size difference between male and female, in our species is not very impressive for a primatologist because other primates have a lot bigger difference. But anyway, we have that difference too. Then gender is much more complex. Gender, I usually don't divide in male and female. I divide in masculine and feminine and everything in between. It's a much more flexible concept. It relates to the expectations and the norms of the society. And that's also why it changes over time, and it changes from place to place. And so gender is a much more flexible concept, which I think is also applicable to other primates, and I'll get to that. But of course, usually when we talk about other species, we talk about sex. I know nowadays people mess things up a little bit, and they say, what is the gender of your dog? I'm not sure that's the right terminology to use for the dog, but that's what people do. So it's basically the nature-nurture distinction, and of course in biology we all say that these two things cannot be teased apart. There is no pure nature and there's no pure nurture in the world, but people try to find them always, and the media tries to find them also always. So do apes have genders? That's one question that I address in my book, and I think they do, because if gender is what you learn from others, which is cultural, if gender, how you learn to behave from others, I think that may apply to other species. So in humans, we talk about that because we are very slow in our development. We are adult when we're 18 or 20. And in that time, we learn an enormous amount of things. The reason we are so slow is because we need to learn a lot of things in our life before we are adult. But if you look at the other apes, chimps and bonobos, they are adult, we think, when they're 16. They have a longer nursing period in general than humans, and so they stay babies for a longer time, actually. And they're very slow, and so they learn a lot of things in their lifetime too. And we talk a lot about culture in animals nowadays and the transmission of behavior from one generation to the next generation. And I think that includes also sex-typical behavior. And so in that sense, we can talk about gender in other species as well. So the nursing is very slow. In orangutans, it's even slower. They nurse for 8 years. So they're not fully dependent. The young primates are not fully dependent on milk during all those years, but it is a very long nursing period. So we speak increasingly about culture in other primates because they learn from others. And there are indications in the literature, not a lot, but because people are not looking for it, but there are indications that young females learn more from their mother and other adult females, and young males learn more from other males. So, for example, there's a recent study on orangutans in the forest where the young females ate exactly the same foods. There's thousands of foods they can choose from, exactly the same foods as their mother. The young males did not, and that is, the young males had their own diets which deviated from their mother, and that's partly because they're watching adult males who come by and pick up their behavior. And so there's increasingly indications that there's a sort of sex-typical copying of behavior going on, probably having to do with gender identity that they have. And so there's increasingly that kind of thinking around it. And I usually call that self-socialization, is that you learn more from your own gender than from the other gender, and you mimic and emulate your own gender more than the other gender. But it doesn't need to be necessarily that boys mimic men. It can also boys mimicking women, and so there's self-socialization theory for transgender children, which was developed by Joan Rothgarden, who is a biologist and a trans woman. And she proposes that this also applies to trans children who tend to emulate models of the sex they identify with. And I'm not sure that that idea applies to other primates. I don't think we're at the point that we can say that, but it's interesting to think about self-socialization, and I think in the primates, a lot of self-socialization is going on. Another issue that I'm interested in is the play behavior of the young. And I'm not going to talk about the males, I'm just going to say something about the females here. Young female primates are very interested in infants and dolls. If you give dolls to, for example, this is Coco the gorilla, if you give dolls to or a chimpanzee in a sanctuary, they're picked up by females. You shouldn't give them actually to males, because males, what they do with the dolls is they open them up and they want to look inside. The females put them on their belly, on their back, on their nipples. They build nests for them. In the wild, chimpanzee females have been found, young females, to pick up wooden logs and rocks and put them on their belly and their back, and they build nests for them. And so the females are very interested in sort of maternity games. And they also play them with the infants of other females. And it's very important for them, because if they don't have that experience, they cannot be good mothers, actually. So we often talk about the maternal instinct, and we think that maternal care is instinctive. But if you have, for example, at a zoo, a gorilla female, a young female who's pregnant, and has never seen gorilla babies and has never seen a mother handling the babies, you know it's going to go wrong. So actually what zoos do sometimes is they bring in a human mother who nurses in front of the gorillas or the other apes to show them how things are done. So these maternity games, they're absolutely important to them. I'll show you some data on this. It's the only data that I've brought, which is how infants are handled by males or females. And if you see for the adults, which are mostly the mothers themselves, it's mostly females who do it. But if you look at the young ones, the immatures, which don't have children of their own, it's also the females who do it. And so males are not particularly interested in infants. If a female comes in with a newborn baby in a group of monkeys, she's going to be surrounded by young females who all want to touch the baby and handle the baby. There's not going to be many males in that subset of individuals. And so there's a lot of babysitting also going on, which is mostly done by females. And so these maternity games that they play are absolutely important for their future career as mothers. I'll show you a little video on this. This is in monkeys.
Mothers set up a baby and toddler group in a quiet part of the temple. But looking after baby is a full-time occupation. So once they are 3 weeks old, if mom wants a break, she has a solution. Employ a teenage babysitter. As these young females develop feelings of love and care, they just want to hold a baby. It's an arrangement that gives the moms a break, a chance to be pampered and groomed.
So the babysitting actually is not limited to the primates. Of course, there's in elephants and whales. There's many stories about babysitting by young females, and that's how they learn how to be mothers. Now, the last thing I want to mention is potentials. So these are differences between the sexes or behaviors by individuals that we don't often get to see, but that are very important. And I think they're often overlooked. And in exploring for my book, I noticed how often we have overlooked. I think we in primatology, we have a tendency to look for the typical male and the typical female, and to overlook all the exceptions to the pattern. And so in going over things, I developed the idea that we actually have overlooked that systematically. So I want to give you one example. This is a female chimp, Donna, who I knew from very young. She was a baby of 3 years old when I knew her. She wanted to wrestle with me all the time. She wanted to wrestle with adult males, which is really much more a male behavior than a female behavior, the wrestling business. The males do roughhousing the whole day, basically. And so Donna wanted to do that, and then later she grew into a male-like character with big shoulders, big hair, big head. And she started to associate with the males. She hung out with the males all the time, and she acted with them. She was not particularly sexually interested in males or females. She was what I call asexual, but she was a male-like character. And of course, I cannot ask her identity, but I would say she was probably trans. I find that kind of individuals, I would say, 1 in 10 or 1 in 20 individual primates that I have known have been different from the rest. Sometimes some individuals have more homosexual behavior than heterosexual behavior. In bonobos, that is really not a difference that I make, because I call them bisexual. They don't make a big difference between the genders of the partners that they have. But there are many individuals who are exceptional. And I think we have overlooked that in primatology. We have focused on the typical male and the typical female. And I suspect there's as much gender diversity in their circles as in our society. The big difference with our society is that there are no problems. So Donna was completely accepted in her group. There was no fuss about her situation. And in all the primates that I know, I think the individuals who are slightly different than the rest, who don't fit the mold necessarily, they are very well accepted. The second issue I want to mention is female leadership. All the primates have female hierarchies. There's a male hierarchy, female hierarchy. Most of the competition is within the gender, not between. So you have usually an alpha male and an alpha female. In many primate groups, those two actually work together. They don't exclude each other. It's not like the alpha male and the alpha female exclude each other. They work together and they do things together. So female leadership you find everywhere in the primates. And I think we need to make a distinction between physical dominance and power. In not all species, I would say in most species, the females are not physically dominant over the males because the males are bigger. But they can have a lot of power. And so Mama, the chimpanzee on the left, my previous book was about her. She was a very powerful figure. Basically, a male could not be alpha male without her support. And so she had an enormous amount of power. And then in bonobos, where the females are generally dominant over the males, the alpha female is also alpha over everybody. So female leadership is really not hard to find in the other primates, even though I know that many people think that the primates are fully dominated by males. I don't think that's the case. And then the last potential I want to mention is actually very important in the discussion nowadays about the involvement of men in families and how much they work in the family or for the children. Is people always say that that's not natural for men necessarily to do. But you know, there's an enormous nurturing tendency in males that you don't always get to see. So for example, in chimpanzees and bonobos, the adult males, they don't do anything except for maybe protecting a female with young. They will protect them, but they don't carry the kids, they don't feed them, they don't do anything with them, except if a female loses her life and all of a sudden you have an orphan in the group, then males may adopt them. And so there are reports of chimps in the Thai forest in West Africa. 10 males have adopted offspring like that. And so they're not their own offspring. They're not necessarily the fathers of these babies that they adopt. They don't adopt them for 2 days. They may adopt them for 5 years. And so they become real father figures. And in this picture actually shows an older brother who has adopted a younger brother after the death of their mother. And so there's an enormous caring potential in the males that we don't always get to see. And I think in the human male it's even more developed because we are a species that develop nuclear families. And so obviously we have more of these tendencies, I think, than in chimps and bonobos. But the nurturing tendency of males is also very often underestimated. And that's all I wanted to say as an introduction. So I'm asking Isabella to come up.
Hi, I'm Isabella Rossellini, and I would like to, so if chimps have culture and there's gender, did you feel the urge to write this book because this is what you're looking at more recently, something that was ignored before?
No, I wrote the book because when I talk about emotions or intelligence in animals, and I mentioned that the females are different from the males, there's always people zoom in on that question. People want to know more about that, and I think many people are skeptical about the story that all the gender differences are purely cultural. And so they want to hear from a primatologist what he thinks about that. And so I thought my initial impulse was I'm going to write about sex differences in primates and sex differences in humans and see how they relate to each other. In the end, I'm actually talking quite a bit. It was not my intention initially about gender diversity, because I found that also fascinating, is that we may have underestimated that in our studies.
You gave the example of Donna. Do you have other examples? Do you have males that are not dominant, they don't want to fight?
Actually, in the Arnhem Zoo, where I recently was, the biggest male who you would think should be alpha male, he's not interested in the games that the males play, and so he stays completely out of it. And so that happens actually quite often, is that males don't want to be involved in these scuffles and stay out of it. Because it's very stressful also.
Do they get the girls?
No.
Are the male that are the female prefer males that are dominant or males that are?
The males who stay out of these political games are not most popular with the females, because they're also not very protective of them. So if there's a big fight and they have a female friend who is in the fight, they're not going to defend her because they stay out of these things. And so they're not so popular for that reason, I think.
I saw Sarah Hardy, another primatologist, wrote about the strategy of female. The more promiscuous they are, the more they mate with all the male chimpanzee, the better chance they have not to have infanticides, because the chimpanzee, if they haven't mated with one of the female might kill the babies. Is that correct?
Yeah, so female chimps have far more sex than they need in order to get pregnant. So,
Oops.
And this is true for many animals, actually. It's certainly true for bonobos, because in bonobos, I think 3/4 of the sex has nothing to do with reproduction. But for chimpanzees, in the field, for example, it has been estimated that a wild female chimpanzee, she has maybe 6 or 7 children in her life, because she cannot have more. There's a long interval between them. She has maybe 6 or 7 children, and she copulates probably 6,000 times in her life. So there's a mismatch between those two. So yeah, and the thinking of Sarah Hardy and others is that females have so much sex with males because the males may be following a rule. The males don't know about fatherhood or paternity. They may be following a rule: be nice with females and their young that you had recent sex with. Which is a rule that makes them, of course, exempt their own offspring from aggressive activities. And so that's a rule that maybe, and for mice, for example, mice has been demonstrated in experiments, but that's maybe a rule that they follow. Yeah.
Well, we don't know. I mean, are you sure they don't know if they? When did we human beings discover that we needed a mommy and a daddy, a man and a female, to be pregnant?
How would they know? There's a pregnancy that follows a couple of months later that you notice it, and it's only in one of the two parties. It's only in the female, not the male. So how would males even know about this connection?
I'm thinking of how did our ancestor did it. Just thinking. I don't know how they got to that conclusion.
There may have been 100,000 years ago, but we don't have evidence for animals that they know that connection.
So, chimpanzees and bonobos, they have two very different behavior. Can you describe, just as a reminder, of the differences, and can you tell us why do you think this happened?
Yeah. It's so interesting that we have two close relatives who are exactly equally close to us genetically, chimps and bonobos. And of course, the anthropologists always make comparisons with chimps. They like chimps because chimps are violent and male-dominated and territorial, and they like that kind of stuff. And so they have made the scenario of human evolution is based on wiping out others and conquering the world and so on. And the bonobo doesn't fit because the bonobo is peaceful and sexy and female-dominated. And so the bonobo is too peaceful for the taste of old-fashioned anthropologists. and has been marginalized. And you can literally see that in books by people where they say, well, we have two close relatives, the chimp and the bonobo, but the bonobo is weird. Or the bonobo, we can ignore the bonobo because they're so strange primates. And so they try to marginalize them. But I think it's very interesting that we have two close relatives who are so different. The chimpanzee is violent. There was a recent study of all the lethal aggression in chimps and bonobos in the field, with 152 cases. 151 of those cases were chimpanzees. One case was bonobos, and there was only a suspected killing. We don't even know for sure that it happened. So there's a dramatic difference in violence between chimps and bonobos. And I think for the gender comparison, it's really a miracle that we've always stuck to the chimpanzee, because the bonobo is equally relevant and gives us totally different information. We don't know exactly why these two species are so different. There are some theories about it. It has to do with food supply and the absence of gorillas in the bonobo habitat. The chimpanzee lives with gorillas, but the bonobo doesn't. So there are some theories about it, but I don't think we know exactly why it happens.
So just to follow the theory and understand it, the chimpanzee needed to be more violent to defend themselves from the gorilla. They were sharing.
No, the gorilla was, the thinking is the gorilla eats the ground vegetation, and so that's for the chimps not available, and for the bonobos it is available. So the bonobos lives in a richer environment, so to speak. But I'm not sure that these theories are so well supported.
Because it happened thousands and thousands of years ago, so we don't know.
No, these
the evolution and the story.
We built models and we tried to see how.
In fact, bonobos were discovered as a different species. They were declared a different species relatively
recently.
Recently, they were mixed in zoos. It must have been quite painful for them. Now, the juvenile playing, I would like to know, I mean, there were these wonderful photos of the chimps and that gorilla with the dolls. How, and in the wild you say they are picking up rocks and sticks. I would like to know how an animal behaviorist studies the animal in the wild, and how do you study animal in captivity, if you use the same techniques?
Oh yeah, I think we use the same techniques. We make a long list, it's called an etogram of behavior patterns, and then we document. In the old days we did it usually by microphone with a cassette recorder. Now we do it digitally. We have digital devices, and you document who does what to whom, and you note the time and the duration and all of that. So it's a very systematic data collection that you do, and it's the same in captivity and in the field. The data collection is the same. The circumstances are very different. And so in the wild, of course, often when there's an aggressive incident that happens, the animals disappear, and because they run and they scream and they disappear. And in captivity, you can follow the whole process. So that's the main difference. Yeah.
And you have to be really fast when they fight. Like reporting.
You become like a sports narrator.
Like a sports narrator.
Yeah,
exactly.
yeah. Like a good sports narrator who gives you all the details. Not like the Americans who cover soccer, because I've given up on that. They miss all the details.
And in captivity, do you think there are differences in behavior because the animals are kept captive than in the wild?
Yeah, I think the social life is intensified in captivity because you have a smaller enclosure usually. I don't like really tiny enclosures. I like them in a big environment, but still, it's always smaller than in the field. And so the social life intensifies. I don't think the basic psychology of the animals is necessarily different. It's a bit like humans who live in the countryside or who live in the city. The city is basically a zoo environment, it's a captive environment. And we don't consider humans who live in the city less human than people who live in the countryside. So the psychology stays a human psychology, but yeah, it adapts to the environment, and the environment, that's actually Donna, who you see a picture here.
Donna. Yeah. You wrote so touchingly about a chimp who had lost a baby, and you had to teach her how to, you brought her an orphan, but you had to teach her how to nurse with the bottle.
Yeah.
Can you tell that story?
Yeah, that's a female named Kuif who had lost 3 babies due to lack of lactation, so she didn't have enough milk for them. And each time she went into a deep depression, and yeah, it was horrible to see because she would be sitting in a corner crying basically for days. And so at some point we wanted to sterilize her, but then a baby became available from elsewhere. And so I took the baby chimp, and I demonstrated her for 6 weeks with a bottle, how to bottle feed. And so I did that every day in front of her. And then after that period, I gave her the baby. It's an interesting thing, she didn't want to take the baby, because in chimps there's a sort of rule, like it was my baby, she cannot just take my baby away, so she didn't want to touch it, and we had to convince her to pick it up, and then she picked it up, and the big problem was that she thought the milk was also for her. So we had to teach her it was for the baby. So yeah, we went through all that, and she became a very good mother, and she actually raised, in the future, after that, she raised her own offspring also on the bottle. And she was eternally grateful to me. I didn't have a particular close relationship with her before the whole affair, but after that, each time I showed my face, usually after 1 or 2 years, I would come to the zoo and she would run up to me and she would not let me go if I wanted to leave. And so, yeah, she was very attached to me after that whole affair.
The way you talk about chimpanzee and say, you know, that she was so happy to see you, that's a modern way to talk about animals, especially from scientists, because scientists wanted to be detached, gave animals numbers, not to get attached to them. How did you, in your career, had to change that attitude from the scientific detachedness to instead this emotional involvement with the animals?
Well, in a way, I was very lucky. I had a professor who was specialized in facial expressions. And so like Darwin and the face, you know, and he worked on chimpanzees and other primates. And so he was open to the idea of emotions in animals. Was one of the few people who was at the time. And so I learned to talk about these issues because he talked about it and he joked about it, and he's a very funny man and he was very open-minded about that. And so I was always a little bit less restricted, but I did grow up in a time in which people didn't want to talk about animal emotions, animal thinking, even something like animal cognition is not something you could say. You had to put it between quotation marks. So I grew up in a time where people were very strict about these things. And so, for example, nowadays we say that chimpanzees laugh because they make laughing sounds, but I was instructed I would have to call it vocalized panting or something like that. So a chimpanzee doesn't laugh in that kind of language.
But Darwin didn't have that. I mean, in his books talks about, Darwin went often to the zoo and would ask the keeper to tickle the monkeys or the apes. Yeah. And he would go home and tickle his 8 children and then would say, oh, they laugh, they seem to laugh too. And he made comparison. He was much freer than we became.
Yeah, yeah. Darwin was much freer. That was in the 19th century. Then came the 20th century, and then we had Skinner. Skinner, an American, wanted... I'm a European ethologist, and we still have that competition going. So Skinner, we often call it jokingly physics envy. He wanted to be as strict and as hard-nosed as physics and chemistry. And so that's why they're called behaviorists. We only talk about behavior. We talk about nothing else. Animals don't think, they don't feel, they don't plan, they're not conscious, they're not sentient. We only talk about behavior. And so the hammer came down in the previous century on all that stuff. And that was extremely influential. And it's only now that we're sort of wrestling away from it.
To be precise, I mean, Skinner did that because he said that emotions and thought were too private to be analyzed by science. So I don't think he denied it, but he says it's beyond our knowledge. And yet today we are, talking about gender and how an animal might be born a male, but like female, but be more. So we came a long way.
Yeah. We have changed perspective dramatically in the last.
I would like to read you from your book, your wonderful book. You read about Richard Dawkins, also somebody who talks about gene, and in his book, The Selfish Gene, basically says that we are just like bosses. The genes jump from us to now children, and then we are ruled and guided by genes. We have an illusion that we can think and have free will. So he writes, and you quote him in the book, and I want you then to contest what he says as you do in your book. Richard Dawkins writes in The Selfish Gene, "Be aware that if you wish, as I do, to build a society in which individuals cooperate generously and unselfishly toward common good, you can expect little help from the biological nature."
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
and he's English. He's not an American.
So Dawkins actually is a Tinbergen student, and I'm a Tinbergen student indirectly, because Tinbergen was a Dutch ethologist. And so at a very basic level, Dawkins and I are completely in agreement, and I've actually had debates with him in person. At a very basic level, we are in agreement. But I don't agree that we can extrapolate from selfish genes, which is a metaphor for genes, to selfish psychology. I think that there's selfish genes. Of course, genes cannot be selfish. They're just little chunks of DNA, so they don't have selfishness. But he uses it as a metaphor, and then he draws as an extension that we are born selfish. And he knows that it's a metaphor and that he shouldn't take it literally, but he does it on occasion, like in this particular sentence. And I disagree with that. I think there's an enormous amount of kindness and cooperation in the animal world that you can find. You can also find an enormous amount of selfishness and conflict, of course. If you look for it, you will find it. But I don't think we can simplify things that way. And when we say, people sometimes say that, is that nature is essentially competitive and aggressive, a struggle for life type of thing. I think, well, the struggle for life is clearly there, but it has provided us with an enormous amount of cooperative species.
I mean, if you're cooperative and unselfish, sometimes that would be maybe the best strategy to survive.
Yeah.
So that also must have evolved. Altruism.
So it's not uniquely human. So we claim the positive things for ourselves. We call that humane. We are humane. And when we are nasty, we say that we're acting like animals. And so the nasty things we put into nature, and the good things we
take for ourselves.
We deserve the credit for that.
Now, I'm going to read from your book a sentence that stayed with me because we have language and we're very proud of our language that makes us communicate. But of course, we have to create categories, right? You have to say a tree, a table, a chair, a person. And so here I read, because language I always thought was, yes, good, but maybe an obstacle too. Language make us slice and dice the world into neat categories, while closing our eyes to any possible blending. It is the opposite of how nature operates. And then you quote Milton Diamond, a reproductive biologist at Stage, "Nature loves variety. Unfortunately, society hates it." So diversity is essential, even individual diversity. I mean, we all have two noses, one nose and one mouth, and we're all different. And this can be also in behavior and in gender.
Yeah. So nature is much more flexible and variable than people tend to think. You walk into a forest and you see two trees of the same species and they will be looking very different, and sometimes it depends on the amount of light they got, and so it's the environment, but sometimes it's a genetic variability. And so there's an enormous amount of variability, and actually natural selection operates on variability, that it needs variability to do that. And that is often underestimated. What we humans do is we label, so LGBTQ, that's all labeling right there. We put labels on everything, and if you fall between the labels, you're out of luck because we don't know what to do with you. I think it's harmful in some ways. I think it's wonderful that we have the language capacity, but as I said, the animals that I know, the individuals who deviate from the common patterns, they are usually fully accepted. And so the only reason I can see why they would not be accepted is if they disturb the peace or are overly aggressive. Then maybe the group will start objecting to them, but otherwise they take individuals as they are. And so the variability that in human society now we make a big fuss about, like transgender people or homosexual people, we make a fuss about them, and some people can't stand them. That is not an issue that comes up in the primates. I've never seen that that's an issue.
Even homosexuality has been noticed in animals, something that it's recently done. I mean, not only in bonobos, but in all other species.
Yeah, it's very common. I think heterosexual behavior is usually in most species more common than homosexual behavior, but homosexual behavior occurs in many, many different species. Bonobos are a bit different because I don't even know what the balance is between the two, and I usually call them bisexual because I don't think it makes a big difference for them. Yeah.
But do you think that, I mean, this is a question that I have, me personally, Isabella. Do you think that we look at mating with just one goal, which is reproductive, and probably it isn't?
Yeah.
And that's true for the animals too.
So we look at two dogs who are mating, we say, and they're breeding. Mm-hmm. That's, of course, in their mind, they're not breeding at that moment, they're having sex. So, we translate all of that in reproductive terms. But I think there's also pleasure involved. Mm-hmm. So, for example, all mammals have a clitoris. Mm-hmm. All female mammals have a clitoris. The dolphin and the bonobo have the biggest clitoris. And they happen to be the two species that have a lot of extra sex, sex that has nothing to do with reproduction in all sorts of combinations. Why would all the females have a clitoris if pleasure was not an issue? So I think that is an issue. And but you know, female sex has been grossly underestimated. Let me tell you a story of how it was discovered that we knew that females had a lot of extra sex that they didn't need for reproductive purposes. So this was discovered in birds, monogamous birds. People had always idealized the monogamous birds and said the male and the female and the eggs, and they care for the young, and they had always assumed that all these eggs in the nest were fathered by the same male of the pair, until we started doing DNA testing on the eggs. And we found that many eggs in monogamous bird nests are fathered by other males. Now, the only thing that the biologists at that point could think, and that's written in their papers, is that the females must have been raped by somebody. But we now know from more careful studies that the females actually go out of their way, they travel away from the nest, they start shouting and yelling so that males come to them, and that's how they get pregnant with these males. And so, no, not pregnant, they get eggs from these males. So we've discovered that with the DNA testing, and in the primates the same sort of thing happened. In the primate studies, we always assumed that the alpha male fathers by far most of the offspring, and so in a monkey group, the alpha male will have more than 90% of the babies. That's what we assumed, until we started doing paternity testing and found that a lot of other things were happening, things that we didn't see because they happen at night or behind the bushes, and so there were other matings going on, and the alpha male has more offspring than other males, and that's why it's important to be an alpha male, but he doesn't have the 90%, he gets just a bigger proportion. Yeah.
I was interesting to talk more about nurture of the males, which was, we know that they're they're more aggressive. I have a farm that is called Mama Farm because we were talking to Frans that male generally fight, whether it's roosters or turkeys, so I tend to get females because they fight a lot to males.
So this is discrimination, right?
He said, if you want to grow your farm, you better get some. You better call it not anymore Mama Farm. So the nurture of the chimpanzee.
But the young animals you get, they come from somewhere else.
Yes, so
and there have been males involved.
Yes, there have been males involved. The reason why I don't have them right now is that I have heritage breed, and I keep this line, and so I let other breeders breed the correct lines, because a lot of just a little diversion, but it's always about animals, and these are the animals that are closest to us, and when I was young and loved animals, loved my dogs, I was reading Jane Goodall or Conrad Lawrence, Steinberger, and I always thought, I should have been born in Africa. What am I doing here? Until I discovered that they are as fascinating, the domestic animal. And now I have a farm, but a small farm. I have heritage breed, and the definition of a heritage breed is an animal that is still capable of mating naturally, raising their offspring, and foraging. Those are capacities that are lost, for example, in modern chickens because they are bred to become obese. We eat chickens that are 7 or 8 weeks old. They're not even chicks. They're chicks. They're babies, and so that's why I don't mate them. I don't mate them because I'm afraid to mix the lines, and I want to keep the biodiversity. But I was interested in the male being nurtured, and that male that adopted the chimp. In one of the interviews that you gave, it was also the biology, if you want, of that chimp changed, because he had, when you did a test, or I think it's a blood test or saliva test, you said that he had more oxytocin. So it was mixed. That nature and nurture, you can't divide them.
Yeah, so that's actually research on human males. Human males, when they become fathers, they drop in testosterone and they develop more oxytocin. And there is a study that was done in Israel where they looked at men who are the primary caretakers of children. So not just helping their wife raise the children, but they are the primary caretakers. And they change, their brain changes. Their amygdala becomes bigger, they have a lot of oxytocin. They get a more maternal brain, actually. And so that's the brain plasticity that we know exists nowadays. And so men have an enormous potential in that regard. And so when people make jokes about paternity leaves, for example, saying that that's not really needed, maternity leaves maybe are needed, but not paternity leaves because taking care of children is not natural for men, I think they are underestimating the flexibility that exists in our species.
And in animals, because the flexibility is also important for evolution, because they can pick up something that it is intrinsic and build it up.
There's actually a study that was done in the 1950s where they took babies away. Well, they did that in those days. They did that kind of stuff on the primates. They took babies away from macaque mothers and put them in a group with adult males. And they compared them later, after several years, with young monkeys who had been raised by their own mothers. And they could not find a difference. The males had done a very good job raising those kids, carrying them, holding them, all of that.
Can I ask you about human us? When you told me that when you started in the field, there were mostly men, and now there is a lot of women primatologists. Do women primatologists bring in a different point of view or different interest in the field?
Yeah, I think it's a different interest. It's not a different science, because the science remains the same of how you collect your data, how you analyze your data, how you publish it, and all of that. Because people sometimes think that the science is different, but the topics are different. When women came to the field, when I was a student, there was mostly men, and now there's like 75% or more of the primatologists is women. The women came in and they got interested in family relationships, in childcare, in female choice, how do the partners choose each other, whereas the man had been mostly interested in hierarchies and violence and territoriality. And so the man had a very different interest. And so for example, if you look at a baboon troop, in the baboons, the males are twice the size of females. So obviously, the first thing you see moving is going to be males. And the male primatologists had described the baboon troop as dominated by males and completely run by males, until we now know that it's basically a female group in which the males go in and come and go out. And the males are not the center of the group. It's the female kinship network that's the center of the group. And so yeah, the female primatologists, they brought a very different perspective. And female choice was also a very important issue, because it was always thought that matings were arranged by the males. The male hierarchy decided who would mate, who would mate with whom. But actually the females have a big say in that.
Now, you are preparing a next book. And we were talking before meeting, and I am very interested in your next book and the urge to write about the history of how animal behavior is changed. This is a relatively new science. Would you think that Konrad Lorenz found it in the 30s, 40s, and there was the war, he came to an interruption, then it became here in America, right after the war, enormous, and now it exploded. But it's really relative comparison to other science, isn't it?
Well, when I was a student, animals were machines. Stimulus response machines, or in ethology, where I came from, they were instinct machines. And so animals had no mind, they had no emotions, the inner life was completely denied. And this was true on both sides of the Atlantic. And it was I would say, a very bleak picture. And now we are at a very different point. We read in the newspaper every week, so to speak, a new discovery that has been made. Bumblebees imitating each other, or chimpanzees having a theory of mind. So all these things are coming out at the moment. And the whole perspective has changed, so that if I would say here in front of this audience that animals have no emotions, and they are just like machines, that would be probably a revolt. Whereas if I had said that 30 years ago, there would have been a lot of nodding, and yes, that's how it is. So I think that there's a dramatic change, and I've lived through that whole change. I've been part of it by things that I discovered, but there's many other people. And actually, the discoveries in that regard started already 100 years ago. So before I was born, there was Wolfgang Köhler was the main one. And to say it crudely, he pissed off the behaviorists tremendously by saying that animals could think. They were very upset with Köhler. And I still meet, on occasion, behaviorists of the old school who cannot pronounce the name Köhler. They begin trembling and they go like Köhler, you know, because Köhler is the one who told them that animals can think, and they didn't want to believe it. So what Köhler did actually, he would hang a banana very high and give his chimps sticks and boxes, and he would not train them at all, and he would see what they would do. And sometimes some of his chimps, they would, after a while, pick up the sticks and the boxes and stack them up and get to the banana. And so he said they have done that without training, without trial and error, so they must have solved the problem in their head. And this was so anathema to what the behaviorists were saying. But now we have many interesting examples of this kind of insight. So a beautiful example, recent research is you give a plastic tube to an ape. So the tube stands up, and at the bottom you put a peanut. And that's all you do. Now the chimp can try to reach in or try to shake the thing, but they cannot get the peanut out. Now some of these animals, they go to the water faucet. You're taking your water. They go to the water faucet and they take a sip of water and they spit it into the tube. And they spit multiple times until the peanut floats up and they can take it out. Now it's a very interesting solution because the tool is not given to them. They have to come up with and the water is not normally a tool for them. So they have to come up with that solution. And if it's done on children, 4-year-old children, I think 10% of the kids can do it. 8-year-old children, I think 2 out of 3 can do it. But it's for children also a challenging task.
So they need a mind and they need a thought in their mind. Of course, animals perceive the world different than us, and this is something that we often forget. I mean, maybe apes are similar to us. They have senses closer to us, but other animals have senses completely different.
We have to get used to that. That's a very difficult problem for us, is to understand animals from their perspective.
Yes, how they see, or if they see, and if they see the same color and all that. So, Frans, you're retired. Are you still seeing chimpanzees and bonobos? Do you miss them?
I do miss them. I don't see them very often anymore. The last time I saw bonobos was right before the COVID crisis in Kinshasa, where there's a big sanctuary near Kinshasa. But other than that, no. And I go to the zoos that I used to work with, but no, I don't see many animals anymore. No.
I'm sure you miss them.
Yeah.
So anyway, if you want to start lining up for questions to Frans, I think I exhausted all my questions. Let me see if I have more. I read all your book. And they are so fantastic, and they taught me so much. And although it was about chimpanzees and bonobos, I ended up just studying chickens, but still it was helpful. And chickens have personalities. I mean, this is another thing. I mean, we expect partially personalities in chimpanzees and bonobos who are close to us, but even animals like chickens, they have distinct personalities.
They do now research on personality in fish, like zebrafish. I recently visited a lab where you had tanks with zebrafish, and then you tap on the glass. You have the shy type, they go to the back of the tank, and you have the bold type. If you tap on it, they come all forward. So they breed zebrafish on different personalities.
And probably it's different to understand the in-between. We might understand extreme, as we have seen in male-female or feminine behavior and masculine behavior. It's easier to see the extreme, but it's difficult to see the in-between. I have the same problem with my chicken. I recognize the chicken that always gets out of the coop, enters the house. If I leave the door of my car open, boop, she goes right in. And the other one that is always running away. So I recognize the extreme behavior, but probably there is a lot of gray that it's... And familiarity. This is another thing that I always thought it was essential, that familiarity, you know, I'm an actress, and sometimes I think what I can bring as an actress to animal behavior. And acting is relating to another person, empathy. You know, a writer writes the words, and we say those words. And I can say, and it doesn't matter what I'm saying, I have to establish with the other actors what the feeling are. And I can say, I love you, but you understand, I hate you, because it's the way I'm saying it, is my body language. So I was never so attracted to the studies of animal call or fix things, because I could know as an actress, that's not the way it works. It's very fluid. It's very difficult to, and yet it's empathy. And when I looked at scientists trying to be detached from animals, I wondered how I could do as an actress. I cannot be detached from my partner. It's a game of empathy where we communicate with empathy. And that is essential also with animals, I would say, to understand
Yeah,
them.
it's absolutely essential. So I know some scientists who work on primates and try to keep their distance, and then the primates often don't want to perform or are not interested in the task because there's not a shared interest in the task. And the best scientists I've had in my lab who work with chimpanzees are the ones who are very chimpy, as I call them, who act like chimps and relate to them, and then the chimps become their friends, And then they do all sorts of things for you. And I think that's true for many animals. Yeah.
And you understand them. I mean, the same way when we pick up the phone and a husband or a wife says hello, you immediately say, what's wrong? Because just that word, the tone, tells you if the person is happy or unhappy. And you need that familiarity, I think, to communicate, isn't it?
Yeah.
Let me get my pen.
So maybe if we have questions, we can put
yes,
the lights on a little
yes.
bit so that we can see who is...
I want to ask you one more question, a general question, and that is, can we really learn from animals or not? I mean, you study animals because you're interested in animals, but then there is the temptation to apply it to us.
I don't draw a line between humans and animals. For me, humans are animals. So for me, it's a bit of an odd question. Of course, we can learn from them. You don't necessarily need to follow their example, if that's what people mean by learning from them. We don't need to act like bonobos. And I think it is sort of interesting that we have here all these people sitting together without fighting and without sex, which in the primates would not necessarily happen. So we don't need to follow their example, but we can certainly learn something about ourselves because we are part of nature. And,
but we can also say that, for example, sometimes it has been determined, people say, oh, homosexuality is against nature, but it is not against nature.
Yeah.
You might not like it or not approve it, but it's not against nature, because in nature anything is possible. All of it happens. There's an enormous variability.
Our relation with nature is actually a big problem, I think, in the sense that we've now seen with the COVID crisis that our economy can be wiped out by a little virus. We have the climate crisis, which is our mishandling of nature, basically. And so philosophy and ultimately religion has given us this separation between humans and nature. We are above or outside of nature. And this is something that's coming back to bite us. And actually the distinction between human and animals is part of that story. And I had to think of that after the COVID crisis, when all the people were so happy to see each other and touch each other and embrace each other, because we couldn't do that for about 18 months. And that shows our primate nature. We're not happy with having just contact digitally on a little screen. We want to smell and feel and be up close to each other, which is very much primate-like. Let me tell you one interesting story about that, a chimpanzee story. We had, for our chimpanzee colony where I work at the Primate Center, they have an outdoor area. We had decided to build a new climbing frame. And so we spent 2 weeks with a lot of wood and big frame, very high, so that they could look all over the landscape. And we were very proud of what we did. And during that time, we locked up the chimps in buildings, and so they were all separated in little groups, and they were locked up for 2 weeks. Then after 2 weeks, we released them. And it's a bit like after the COVID crisis. But we thought, naively, they would be thrilled to see the climbing structure. They would all come out and race up there and be impressed by what we had done. But what happened in the first 2 hours, they didn't look at the structure at all. They were all embracing and kissing and hanging out and grooming and having sex in the way. They were so happy to see each other after 2 weeks being locked up. That was much more important to them than that whole climbing frame that they afterwards explored. And so that's a bit how I felt after the COVID crisis. People were really thrilled to see each other, and it shows our primate nature.
It is great to be back with all of you without masks so we can see you.